Hello, I'm the Bearded Halfling, and after discussing the bill hook in the last episode, I thought today we'd discuss another very English weapon. Yes, today we're talking about a weapon as English as St. George, the Killers, most of the English royalty, and the British Museum. Yes, today we're talking about the longbow. Wait, what? What do you mean it's Welsh? Guess it is as English as the British Museum. Yes, the English warbow is actually Welsh, and at this moment I also think it's important to talk about important distinctions and clarifications before we begin properly. This video is about the warbows and the longbows used by the English and the Welsh during the 100 Years' War. So predominantly the main features are they have to be made out of yew wood and have to be used during that period. Obviously bows cover a large period and most cultures use bows at some point. We're not going to be talking about them, although I would love to do an episode on Nubian war bows at some point because those things are very cool. No, today we are focusing on the English and Welsh yew longbow. Yew trees made incredibly good bows. The inner layers of yew wood were very flexible, whilst its outer layers were more firm and rigid, which are also the two traits that you want when making a bow. Most longbows used in warfare had a draw weight of around 120 pounds and stood more than 6 feet tall. Or if you're Welsh, the equivalent of picking up 362 leeks every time you draw back the bow. And when a skilled archer could loose up to 12 arrows a minute, that's quite the workout. In fact, to be ordered to use these weapons, longbow training had to start at a very young age, basically from boyhood. So when these weapons took about a decade to actually be able to use one properly, why were they used so often and were they really worth it? Well, let's have a look at the history. In about the 11th or 12th century, the Welsh began to use the longbow quite often. When Edward I began his campaign into Wales in the late 13th century, of his 15,000 strong army, around 9,000 of them were from South Wales, many of who were the longbowmen. Now clearly Edward was impressed with these longbowmen, because later on when he continued his hobby of conquering the British Isles and invaded Scotland, he took many of these longbowmen with him. And when the pride of the English army, its heavy knights, struggled against the spearmen of the Scottish at the Battle of Falkirk, it was the longbowmen who stepped forward and were able to take out these heavily defensive positions. And things only got worse for the English knights. During the Battle of Loudon Hill and the Battle of Bannockburn, English heavy cavalry, the pride of the English army, were soundly defeated by Scottish spearmen, and in 1346 the longbow proved its worth where the knights were failing. At the Battle of Crecy, a highly outnumbered and mostly outskilled English army were able to defeat a French force more than twice, potentially 3 times their size, thanks mostly in part to the use of the longbow. And less than a couple of months later, a highly outnumbered English army was able to defeat a Scottish force more than twice their size by using the longbow to break up the Scottish charge. And this feat was repeated at the Battle of Poitiers, when once again a French army was annihilated by a much smaller English force. Edward III was so impressed, he expanded on a previous law in 1363, making it mandatory for all adult men to practice archery on holidays, Sundays, and feast days, giving him a large source of archers whenever he needed it. The longbow would remain in use in the English army for centuries. It was used widely throughout the War of the Roses, the Battle of Flodden, and in 1588, when the English army was preparing for the invasion of the Spanish Armada, its army comprised of large troops of longbowmen. In fact, some argue that the longbow was used in the Battle of Tippermoor in 1644. So, why the longbow? Why did it see so much use? And I think we've already touched on it a bit, but I think it's worth having a bit more of a look in depth as to how effective the longbow really was. Well, first off, individually, a longbow was an incredibly effective weapon, able to loose 12 arrows a minute up to a range of 1,000 feet. This was an impressive weapon for its time. Additionally, bodkin arrowheads allow for the piercing of most mail armor of the period. Additionally, the longbow was a cheap weapon. Compared to the armor and the weapons of knights, longbowmen and, honestly, the peasants who wielded them were 2 a penny, meaning that you could mass longbowmen in a single battle that you couldn't with knights, meaning that these 12 arrows a minute up to 1,000 feet weren't just from a handful of archers, they were from thousands. This normally meant by the 14th century, at least half of the English army's men were longbowmen, and at the Battle of Agincourt, archers potentially outnumbered men-at-arms and infantry up to 5 to 1. The sheer mass of arrows in the air at any one point meant that any army advancing on their position would be thoroughly pincushioned by the time they actually got to fight the infantry. Okay, this is the point in the video that I talk controversial topics. And me saying this is going to get angry people in my comments, because the longbow has been mysticized and it's been put up, into myths so often and so regularly that there's a lot of things about the longbow which simply aren't true, which is commonly held belief. So here goes. The longbow could not effectively pierce plate armor. There, I said it. I'm sorry, but it's true. The longbow, even the bodkin heads, could not pierce plate. Mail armor was useless against bodkins. The heads were simply too thin and pierced straight through. But plate armor, arrows just bounced against it. And whilst, yes, a knight taking multiple blows from arrows shot from longbows will tire them out and will probably put them on their back, it did not pierce plate armor, at least from most of the evidence we have seen. So why do so many people think the longbow was so good against plate? Well, largely because of its effectiveness against the French knights. The French knights wore plate armor, but were still easy prey to the longbow. And the reason for this wasn't because the arrows pierced plate, was because, well, whilst the knights wore plate, the horses weren't so lucky. And we see this at the Battle of Verneuil. French heavy cavalry charged down English longbow positions and were easily taken out. However, the Milanese mercenaries had armoured horses as well as armoured men, and they were able to charge down the longbow position and take them out very effectively. The French still lost the battle, but the Milanese knights proved the advantages of pure heavy cavalry. However, none of this truly takes away from the longbow. It was the weapon which dominated Western European warfare for well over a century, and English mercenaries with their famous longbows were prized throughout Europe. None of this is to say that the longbowmen were invulnerable or perfect. There are battles where, especially when they're caught out of position or they're not able or don't have time to make proper defenses for the longbowmen, they are caught out in the open, particularly by cavalry, and this does happen a couple of times. But honestly, the longbow dominated Western European warfare for close to a century. Whew, okay, so that was 10 or so minutes of me just geeking out about longbows. And I'm not even touched on fantasy or anything, or world building or anything like that yet. So buckle in. I think after last week's 20-minute video, this is going to be another long one. So the first thing I want to discuss about longbows in fantasy is the world building elements that are baked into it. Because the longbow takes such a long time to actually build the muscles to be able to use, then they might be perfect weapons for elves or dwarves or other long-lived races who would have the time to dedicate a decade or two to be able to use the bow. Alternatively, naturally strong and broad races like orcs or maybe even minotaurs may also prove to be excellent archers. Being able to pick up the longbow without the decade or so of strength training required to use them would make them devastating on a battlefield. I do love the idea of a very professional orc army using masked longbowmen to kind of break down those tropes we have of these very sort of like barbaric orcs. And although it does pain me to say it, smaller races like gnomes and, yes, halflings would struggle to use a full-sized human longbow. And whilst they could use halfling-sized bows, they would lack the power and range of the larger human-sized ones. However, if you did want halfling longbowmen in your world building, you can definitely still do this. There are plenty of world building methods that would allow halflings to use shorter but more powerful longbows, like even potentially growing a certain type of wood or cultivating a certain type of wood that was just perfect for making longbows. So don't worry about it too much, just think about it and incorporate it into your world building. And remember, when world building, the longbow works best when used in large professional armies based around infantry. Which does actually bring me back to the idea of dwarves using mass ranks of longbowmen alongside their more traditional heavy infantry. That way the heavy infantry can better protect the archers. Whilst I know elves tend to use bows a lot, when you think about it, elves tend to be a lot more lighter, a lot faster, and focus more on sort of like repositioning and cavalry, whilst these stationary and defensive longbow positions really suit those stereotypes and tropes around dwarves. But hey, that's just me. But on a more individual level, why might an adventurer pick up a longbow? And honestly, I think I've already answered a lot of these questions. 12 hours a minute, 1,000 foot range. I don't think I need to explain much more. But longbows were also incredibly versatile. We've talked about bodkin heads already, very long, fine heads that could pierce through chainmail very effectively. But archers would often carry multiple types of arrowheads with them whenever they went into battle, so they could fulfill multiple purposes. Historically, you do have things like barbed arrowheads that would, shall we say, cause a mess when they were attempted to be removed. Additionally, you have things like fire cage arrows, which are your more historical fire arrows you see in movies, where they would put burning coals or flaming rags inside the cage tips of the arrows to set fire, usually to buildings. Interestingly, hunters would often also use these blunt arrowheads to kill birds without damaging the plumage too much. And these are just historical examples. When we look at fantasy and when we think about fantasy, an archer might carry many more various types of arrows with them to take down certain targets. I can definitely see a ranger using various specialist arrowheads to hunt down their own chosen targets. Though maybe be a little bit careful unless you want to be a bit too Hawkeye with this. Or alternatively, don't be careful about this and be as Hawkeye as you want. Now, for all those who play 5e, the longbow does already have a stat block, and fortunately it's a pretty good one, with a d8 damage at this range. Very nice. But you'll notice something I've talked about a lot in this video is the pure strength required to use one of these bows. And the 5e stat block does not reflect this. A rogue who dipped into a level with fighter with only a strength of 8 could use a longbow potentially better than a fighter with a strength of 16 but a lower dexterity. And I've seen a couple of potential workarounds to try to make this, well, work, one of which is to make it a strength-based weapon. But I'm not the biggest fan of this. because I feel it's a bit too one-minded. Dexterity in 5e does tend to be for how well you can aim shots as well. It's not just a matter of how strong you are to pull it back, you need to be able to aim it as well. In an ideal world, what you would have is a longbow would still use dexterity to hit and to aim and to deal damage, but it would have a minimum strength requirement, something around 14. And to make up for the fact that this is probably a bit punishing towards certain classes and to the longbow in general, I would increase its damage to 2d6 to reflect the weight and the strength required to use the longbow. And yeah, that's basically the longbow. I could talk about it more, but I think I'm quite happy with leaving this at the 15-16 minute mark or something like that. So unless you guys want to hear more about the longbow, how it's used, I might even break down one of the battles. If that's something you want to hear about, put in the comments below, and I will probably keep nerding out about longbows because they are a very cool weapon, and I'd love to see more of them. And I'd love to see the elements that make the longbow a unique weapon considered in world building more, rather than simply just one of those terms and weapons that's kind of thrown about a bit willy-nilly. I'd love to see more of the strength training introduced into the world building. But maybe that's just me. As always, thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been interesting. And yeah, let me know if this has inspired you to use longbows in your campaigns or consider how longbows affect world building. Please let me know in the comments below. I would genuinely love to read about it. I read all the comments and reply to all of them as well, mostly. But yeah, once again, I'm Bearded Halfling, and thank you for listening.